Hey everyone and welcome. If you're just starting your bee farm journey, get ready, because we're about to tackle a concept that's in pretty much everything, from creams to IV drips. I'm talking about emulsions. This stuff is so fundamental, so we're going to break it all down and make sure you've got a really solid foundation.
So, let's start with something you've definitely seen in your own kitchen. You try to make a salad dressing, you shake up that oil and vinegar, and what happens? Within seconds, they're already separating. That's because they're immiscible. They just don't want to mix. Now that's fine for a salad, but what if one of those liquids was a life-saving drug? In pharmacy, we can't just let them separate. We have to find a way to make these enemies play nice.
So, how do we solve that whole separation problem? Well, we're going to tackle it in 4 key parts. First up, we'll get a super clear definition of what an emulsion actually is. Then, we'll go on a tour of the different types you're going to run into. After that, we'll dive into the pretty cool science that keeps them from falling apart. And finally, we'll look at how you, as pharmacists, actually make them.
All right, let's dive right in with the absolute basics. You're going to hear the word emulsion a ton, so let's get a crystal clear idea of what we're really talking about in the world of pharmacy.
Okay, at its very core, an emulsion is just the clever scientific solution to that oil and water problem. It's a system where we take those 2 liquids that refuse to mix, and we basically force one of them to break up into these teeny tiny droplets, we call them globules, and scatter them all through the other liquid.
Every single emulsion has these 2 parts. The dispersed phase, that's the tiny droplets themselves, and the continuous phase is the main liquid that those droplets are floating around in. A great way to think about it is like tiny little islands, the dispersed phase, floating in a big ocean, the continuous phase.
Now, this whole stable mixture doesn't happen by magic. You can't just shake oil and water harder and hope for the best. You need a third, secret ingredient, the emulsifying agent. Think of this thing as a peacemaker. It steps in between the oil and water and forms a protective film around each and every droplet, which stops them from clumping back together and separating out again. So, we've got our 2 phases and our peacemaker. But this basic recipe can be used to create a whole bunch of different systems. Let's take a quick tour of the different kinds of emulsions you'll need to know about.
So, the 2 most common types are pretty much mirror images of each other. It all comes down to who's the island and who's the ocean. In an oil and water, or OW emulsion, you've got oil droplets floating in water. Think of a light moisturizing lotion. But in a water in oil or WO emulsion, it's the exact opposite. Tiny water droplets are suspended in oil, which gives you something much thicker and greasier, like an ointment.
And this is where it gets really cool. By playing with the size of the droplets, we can create some seriously advanced systems. I mean, look at microemulsions and nanoemulsions. The droplets are so incredibly tiny that the liquid actually looks completely clear. This is huge for things like IV drugs. And then you have multiple emulsions, which are kind of like those Russian nesting dolls, an emulsion inside of another emulsion. This lets us do incredible things, like controlling exactly when and where a drug gets released inside the body. Okay, so we know all these different types exist, but that still leaves one big question. How do they actually work? How does that emulsifying agent manage to defy nature and keep these 2 liquids mixed together? That's what we're digging into next. The secret, of course, is all about our peacemaker, that emulsifying agent. There are a few key scientific theories that explain exactly how it performs this little bit of molecular magic. The first theory is all about reducing something called interfacial tension. You can think of this tension as the natural force or the barrier right at the boundary where the oil and water meet. The emulsifier gets right in there and just lowers that tension, making it way easier for the 2 liquids to hang out together without fighting.
Okay, this next theory is like giving each little droplet its own personal bodyguard. The emulsifier molecules literally surround each globule, creating a physical film or a barrier that stops them from bumping into each other and clumping back together into one big layer.
And this is just brilliant. The emulsifier molecule itself is designed perfectly for the job. It's kind of two-faced. It has a head that loves water and a tail that loves oil. So when it gets to that border between an oil droplet and the water around it, it knows exactly what to do. The molecules line up perfectly, tails pointing into the oil, heads facing out into the water. This creates this perfect, stable barrier that just locks the droplet right in place.
So the science makes sense, right? But how do we actually take these theories and use them in the lab? Let's switch gears from the why to the how and look at the practical side of actually making an emulsion.
As you can see here, our real-world recipe is a little more complex than just our 3 main ingredients. You have to think about the product's entire life. We often add antioxidants to stop the oils from going bad. We need preservatives because, well, all that water is a perfect place for bacteria to grow. And of course, if a patient has to swallow it, we'll usually add some flavoring to make it a bit more pleasant.
One of the classic techniques you're going to learn is the dry gum method. And just like the name says, you start dry, you take your emulsifying agent, which is often a natural gum like acacia, and you mix it really well with the oil in a mortar. Once that's combined, you add all the water at once, and then you triturate or mix vigorously. You're actually listening for a specific cracking sound as it turns into a thick, white primary emulsion.
Now, the other main way to do this is the wet gum method. And yeah, you probably guessed it. This time, you start by mixing the gum with the water first. This creates something called a mucilage, which is basically a thick, sticky paste. Then you add the oil super slowly, bit by bit, while stirring the whole time until that final emulsion forms.
So, if you only take one thing away from all this, let it be this. An emulsion is a clever trick. It's how we stabilize a mixture of 2 liquids that desperately want to separate. And the hero of that story is always the emulsifying agent, working behind the scenes to lower that tension and build a protective shield around every single droplet. And this, right here, perfectly captures the soul of pharmacy. This is what you're learning to do. You take these core scientific principles, like how molecules act at a boundary, and you use that knowledge to create real, tangible products that help people every single day. That's the job. So, I'm going to leave you with this question to think about as you continue your studies. Now that you know the basics, start thinking like a formulator. Why would you choose an OW emulsion for a light face cream, but a WO for a thick barrier cream? How could a totally transparent nano-emulsion be the only way to get a certain drug into a patient's vein? The answers to questions like these, that's where this science becomes the art of pharmacy.